Wait, that's happened? A town tried to sell their dead? Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your town's most valuable export isn't wool, grain, or coal, but corpses, not metaphors, not relics, actual dead bodies. It sounds like the setup to a dark comedy or a horror story, but in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, several towns across Britain and beyond found themselves tangled in a grim new economy. This was a time when death, science, fear, and profit collided, and when some communities quietly realized that their graveyards might be worth more than their marketplaces. The problem began with progress. Medicine was changing fast. Surgeons and anatomists were desperate to understand the human body, not through ancient texts, but by cutting it open and studying it firsthand. Anatomy schools sprang up in major cities like London and Edinburgh, filled with students eager to learn surgery properly. But there was one small, inconvenient issue. Bodies were illegal, or at least almost all of them were. By law, only the corpses of executed criminals could be dissected. Unfortunately for medical science, executions were declining just as anatomy classes were booming. The demand for bodies skyrocketed. The supply collapsed. Nature, as always, abhors a vacuum. And so did enterprising humans. At first, the solution crept in quietly. Resurrection men, as they were politely called, began sneaking into graveyards at night, digging just deep enough to break open a coffin and haul out a fresh corpse. They didn't steal jewelry or clothes, that would have been theft. They stole the body itself, which the law, awkwardly, didn't define as property. It was a legal gray zone, wide enough to drive a hearse through. Bodies were bundled into sacks, loaded onto carts, and delivered to medical schools before dawn. Payment was quick. Questions were discouraged. Soon, rumors spread. Graves disturbed. Coffins found empty. Families panicked. People hired guards to watch cemeteries, built iron cages called mort safes over graves, or filled coffins with stones to make removal harder. But the trade didn't stop. It grew. And in some places, towns noticed something unsettling. This was money. In poorer communities, especially those near big medical centers, a terrible logic took hold. A single body could fetch more than a laborer earned in months. Fresh adult males were prized, children less so. The newly buried were worth the most. Suddenly, death had a price tag, and some towns were surrounded by it. Locals didn't always dig up their own dead, but they looked the other way. Guards accepted bribes, officials hesitated. After all, the bodies were leaving the town, and cash was coming back in. The line between supply and crime blurred. In the most infamous cases, it vanished entirely. Why wait for someone to die when the market paid better for the fresh? In 1828, the city of Edinburgh was horrified to discover that William Burke and William Hare hadn't been robbing graves at all. They had been creating bodies. Lodgers disappeared. The dead were delivered straight to an anatomy professor. The town wasn't just selling its dead. It had been quietly financing murder. Public outrage exploded. Riots broke out. Anatomy schools were attacked. Coffins were guarded like treasure chests. The idea that your body might not rest in peace, that it might be sold, studied, or cut apart, terrified people far more than death itself. Trust between communities and doctors collapsed. Medical progress suddenly looked less like enlightenment and more like exploitation. Eventually, governments were forced to act. In Britain, the Anatomy Act of 1832 changed everything. Unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals could now legally be used for dissection. The black market dried up almost overnight. Grave robbing faded. Towns no longer had to pretend they didn't know what was happening in their cemeteries. But the story leaves behind an uncomfortable question. For a brief, disturbing moment in history, some towns realized that the dead could be sold. And that realization didn't come from cruelty alone. It came from poverty, fear, and a system that valued knowledge but refused to pay for it honestly. Progress demanded bodies, and society quietly decided where they would come from. So, when we talk about the price of scientific advancement, it's worth remembering that once, not so long ago, entire communities stood on the edge of a market where the most valuable thing they owned was the person they had just buried. If you enjoyed this strange piece of history, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more.